What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they diver? How do they convert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality.
This is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. In case you're not familiar with us, the Diversity and Spirituality Network is an emerging community of people who are exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. Now, we all have different opinions as to what that looks like, but for me personally, I see diversity as nothing less than a sacred path in and of itself. I'd like to invite you to rate the podcast on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts, which goes a long way to helping us spread the word and share our message of sacred inclusion. Today, our topic is gay spirituality. My two guests have a lot to say on the subject. First up is the Reverend Michael Ruk, the rector of St. Philip's Church in the gay-friendly town of New Hope, Pennsylvania. Michael is an Episcopalian priest who was raised Roman Catholic. The spirit that Michael instills in his church is perhaps best summed up by a statement on the church's website. All are welcome, the statement says, and we really mean it. Artists and accountants, Republicans and Democrats, LGBT and straight people, and those of other faith traditions and of no tradition. No exceptions. My other guest is John Stasio, the founder of Easton Mountain, a multi-faith retreat center and spiritual community primarily for gay men in Greenwich, New York. Back in 1987, John studied nonviolent social change at the Gandhi Peace Foundation in New Delhi, India, and then stayed on in India to work with Mother Teresa's sisters at the Home for the Dying in Calcutta. Later, back stateside, John was a member of the Jesuit Urban Center's urban ministry team, where he provided spiritual direction and body work to people living with HIV/AIDS. A former seminarian and member of the Catholic worker community, John established Easton Mountain in the year 2000. Located on 200 acres near Albany, New York, Easton Mountain, in its mission statement, describes itself as a community retreat center and sanctuary created by gay men as a gift to the world. Gentlemen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
You know, I want to first get a sense of your own journeys, both as gay men and men who have a spiritual calling. So maybe let's start with the religious calling and then move to the gay spirituality piece.
Okay, I guess I'll give it the go. I was raised in a traditional Roman Catholic Polish family that was very much a church-going family, and I was very fortunate that way.
And this is John talking, by the way.
This is Michael talking.
Michael talking, sorry.
And I came from a family that was very much devoted, and religion was an important part of our culture.
Hello.
Practiced the faith not only in church, but at home, and it was just part of my entire being. And as I grew up through the church, I was an altar boy and a lector. I was also very interested in the world of social justice, even as a teenager. I served a time in the United States Congress as a page that formed my understanding of the world and service to the world. But I realized there were some major flaws. What I was seeing in the church I was growing up. There was racism. There was a disconnect from the clergy to people. There wasn't the prophetic view of Jesus, of pronouncing justice and the kingdom of God. And there was, quite frankly, clergy abuse going on. And I started realizing that the Roman Catholic Church wasn't necessarily my home, and I needed to go somewhere else. I was kind of discouraged by the church in many ways, the Roman Catholic Church at that time in my late teens. I never lost faith in God, though, and I never felt alienated from God, nor my Christian faith. I did maybe journey a little bit to explore Eastern religions a little bit, but I still kept myself rooted in Christianity. It really wasn't so much the gay issue that led me out of the Catholic Church, but really a deeper sense of community, a sense of justice that led me to somewhere else. And it was when I was in college that I accidentally stumbled inside an Episcopal church one October morning and met an amazing woman who was the priest there. The first time I ever saw a woman who was a priest, who was deeply rooted in the monastic and contemplative tradition, but also passionate about social justice. And that morning really changed my whole course in life. And I found a place in the Episcopal Church. And, so many years later, I've been a priest for 14 years. So it's that little moment of church in a small town welcoming a wayward sophomore really transformed my whole life and how I see God and the ministry of the church.
John, tell me a little about your, religious story we're talking about.
Okay, well, I'm glad I rejoined you. I got disconnected. Maybe you weren't even aware that I was gone.
I was not. I was wondering why you're so quiet.
Well, that's good. Oh, well, you're talking about religious journey. My spiritual journey began in high school. I guess my spiritual awakening and my sexual awakening, or my coming to understand my sexuality, were kind of happening concurrently. And I was in a conservative all-boys Catholic high school, and waking up to my sexuality and becoming very interested in being a priest. And then those two things came into deep conflict as I grew older. Ended up leaving a seminary, going on to study philosophy in Boston at Boston College, where I became very politicized, both around LGBT. At that point, we didn't even use those letters, issues, and just broader social justice issues. I got really involved with the Central America things. At that time, it was the Reagan administration was waging war on the people in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Got involved with Central America politics, was also involved with South Africa politics on campus, and then gay rights stuff as well. After college, I did have more of a faith crisis and felt as though, as a gay person, the Catholic Church was becoming increasingly a hostile environment for me, and I felt that it was hard. So I started doing yoga and meditating and got involved with Eastern religion, and that took me to India. I spent most of a year in India when I was in my early 20s, and there I met a monk from England. His name is Bede Griffiths, who had an ashram in South India, which was a place where real people from all faiths all around the world. It was a Christian ashram. It was rooted in the monastic tradition, and but had an outwardly very culturally appropriate expression for South India. And it was through that community that I started to reconnect with Christianity. And then as my life continued to journey, I became a massage therapist and a psychotherapist, and worked with a lot of people with HIV/AIDS in the 80s and 90s. Started doing retreats for gay, bisexual men. We used to call it retreats for men who love men. We had guys who were clergy, guys who were married, guys who were in the gay, fully out gay men, but they were really questioning their lives because the health crisis was deeply impacting people. It was really making them stop and question big things, and a lot of young guys were dying. And so this was having a profound kind of existential, creating an existential crisis for young gay men. And so these retreats were full, and people were coming together to heal, to grow, to wake up spiritually, to build community. And we did that in church facilities and YMCA camps for about 10 years. And then a group of us decided to create our own spiritual center, a retreat center, a residential community, a sanctuary in upstate New York. And so in 2000, myself and a few friends and colleagues, we started a retreat center called Easton Mountain. And I've been involved in that ever since. It's primarily served gay men for the first decade, and then has become much more diverse and focused on LGBT community and the larger community. So it's a spiritual retreat center that seeks to offer programming and opportunities for people who are trying to wake up spiritually in the current context, because many institutions and places where people found comfort historically are those connections are breaking down. The environment, the political crisis, the emerging questions of our day sometimes aren't satisfied in traditional environments. So we've created kind of a more edgy place for people to explore. And yet, throughout this whole thing, I've always felt called to priesthood. And so in 7 years ago, I was ordained in the old Roman Catholic tradition. And that's also, although the sacramental ministry is not a major part of my work, it's something that is part of my personal journey and is part of the work that I do at the retreat center as well.
So you both are you both are spiritual men, and you're both gay men, and you're both involved in a spiritual journey, and I imagine you've encountered many people that are like that. So maybe this is a country simple question, but how is a spiritual journey different for gay people than it is for straight people?
I think one of the issues that has to be brought up is the term comes from Henry Nouwen, that people are wounded healers. If all humanity has a wound of some kind, something that hurt them, something that alienated them, and people have to deal with that for the rest of their life in some way, shape, or form. And the term of gay spirituality, if there is such a thing, it's really one of deep wounds that need to be healed throughout someone's life, deep exclusion. And that changes, I've learned, depending on what generation you're a part of. If you're an older man, 70 plus, that's one thing. If you're a man in 50 to 70, it's another time, because you're dealing with the AIDS crisis, versus someone who's maybe under 20 who came out when they're in 6th grade or 8th grade, and no one really minds who they are or who they think is different. So I think the question of gay spirituality is one of a wound and exclusion that needs to be rectified and healed. And it's a process, it's a journey. But it's one that is not one that's meant to exclude people, but it's a way of how do you deal with who you are as who God has made you to be, and you coming to reconciliation with that. And also, how do other people deal with that exclusion?
Well, it's interesting. You kind of bracketed the term gay spirituality. I think you made the how did you say it, as if there is such if there is such a thing as gay spirituality. So I guess that's the question I want to ask. I understand that the wound is something that's there, and I guess to use your terminology, Michael, the wound is a universal thing for gay people. It's a piece about exclusion, and it's different from generation. But do you think there is something specific about how gay people, if you eliminate the wound aspect, is there anything different about the gay experience and spirituality that's different from straight people? And this is an opinion thing. I mean, I don't think there's a final answer to this.
Well, I will pass it to John.
Well, okay.
Talk here.
I mean, Michael and I are from slightly different generations, but I think that the reality of being a gay person makes one question the dominant culture at an earlier time in development than is typical. So while I agree with Michael and Henry Nouwen's insight about the wounded healer and the fact that all of us as human beings have crosses to bear and have wounds to integrate and deal with, I think gay people, and I can only speak to my own experience in a deep way, as a really young person, I came to understand that much of what I was seeing around me was not actually my lived experience. So growing up as a person who was same-sex oriented in a hetero dominated culture made me start to question very basic assumptions about the human experience, which then opened me up to greater mystery and greater to discovery. And I think that is part of the blessing of being a marginalized person, that you realize that the myth that many people are caught up in doesn't really apply to you. And so it can give a certain level of freedom, in addition to giving a certain level of pain and alienation. Now, the question that you're asking about gay spirituality, because that's a term that's thrown around in certain circles frequently, there is a kind of anthropological inquiry into whether or not there is this kind of unique perspective on the human experience that gay people have. A modern American person, Harry Hay, who was a kind of preeminent figure in what's called the radical fairy movement, he believed that gay people were very unique. They were not really male or female, but they were this in-between group. And many people believe they kind of latch on to some of the Native American tribes. We'll talk about these two-spirit people, or talk about the roles that gay people have played in different cultures around the world. It's I know something about all of that, but it's not really my primary interest. Although monastics and nuns, there's been a very high proportion of people in the Christian tradition that where gay people would go into religious life, not fully expressing that or fully integrating that, but many times it was people who had same-sex orientation that would be drawn to the religious life of contemplation or service. So I think this is a big area of inquiry. I don't think we're not going to answer it definitively, but I've certainly encountered a lot of LGBT people who have been drawn to lives of service and lives of spiritual exploration.
And I want to jump in. I want to reiterate what John said, because I think that's very important, that sense of exclusion is many times not just a curse, but a great blessing, because you can open yourself up to deeper compassion. I've seen that with so many people who, because you feel like you're a little bit stepped out of the norm, you understand what it's like to be a minority. You understand what it's like to be excluded. You understand what it's like to be on the outside looking in. And that opens your heart to so many different situations of service, of justice, of love in a different way. And I think that's a great gift that many gay men, lesbian women, trans folks have embraced because of this. So it's a wound that allows you to open your heart up to greater love.
Yeah, there's something about being an outsider, isn't there, of the so-called mainstream experience that enables you to see and maybe witness and, I guess, to serve the mainstream experience in a certain sense, it seems. I mean, obviously this is a question we're not going to resolve, but it's just very interesting just to look at it. Let's talk a little bit about the clerical tradition, the Christian clerical tradition. A very good friend of mine used to do retreats. I don't know, maybe he still does, for seminarians, and it was his opinion that upwards of 50% of the men in that experience were gay, whether they were admitting themselves whether they were admitting to themselves that they were or not. I'm just wondering, both of you are in traditions which I think of as the antithesis of gay friendly. So what is your experience of that, and why do you think that there's this sort of like almost hatred? And I know the Episcopalian tradition, from what you've told me, John, is a little bit different. But I think in general, when you talk about Christianity and gay folks, it's not a happy marriage.
Well, Michael, I don't know. You want to? I mean, I could jump in. I would actually argue, Angelo, that if you really were to look at globally the various religious traditions, you might say Christianity and Judaism are the most friendly when you compare them to some of the Asian cultures or Muslim culture or traditional African. I mean, so really, it's really an interesting thing if you look at big dominant religious movements and the modern changes. But that's really an academic and complex set of things. But I want to at least name that, because I don't actually think Christianity, although there are certain biblical passages that have been used to really hurt people, I don't actually think that the call to justice, the love of people's, the forgiveness, not judging. I mean, Pope Francis famously said, "Who am I to judge?"
Who am I to judge?
You know, and so I think there's some deeply rooted Christian values that actually predispose Christianity to being much more gay friendly, perhaps, than some other traditions. But let's table that for another time. There is a profoundly homophobic subculture within Christianity and within the clerical culture. And that, too, is a very complex set of realities. There's an academic theologian named Mark Jordan, who's written a good deal about the complex relationship between clerical culture and homosexuality. And one of his books is The Silence of Sodom, talks about this. It's kind of a very interesting insight into the way in which the suppression of sexuality within clericalism, within the church, has really been used to, some of the most profoundly homophobic people are themselves gay. So it's a highly complicated thing. And yet there's few places that have, as intact all male culture as Christian clerical culture. Mm-hmm. You know, if you're a gay person who's attracted to beauty and music and culture and philosophy and other men, I mean, where else would you go but into that world? So it's completely alluring. Now, for myself, I didn't step into that in a big way. I was very drawn to it as a young man, but I knew it was a dead end. And so I've stayed very much on the margins of the church. And it was only until Pope Benedict's pronouncements about gay people in the gay men in the priesthood, that really made me feel drawn to absolutely claiming my priestly vocation. Because, and again, that's rather a nuanced set of things that he said, but it essentially made it impossible for a self-accepting gay man to be ordained under the system towards the end of his pontificate. Basically, if you were a closeted, self-hating person, you could probably get through the system. But if you were a maturing, integrated, honest gay person, you were no longer to be ordained. And when that came through, then I said, this is too much, and I will be a priest, a self-accepting, proud gay priest to the gay community. And then I sought orders in a schismatic church for that purpose.
You know, you've encouraged me in a way, without trying to encourage me, to think about the Christian embrace, I'll call it, or relationship, let's say, of gay people a little more positively than I kind of phrased my question. And in order to sort of tilt it back to that direction, I wonder, Michael, can you share about how the sort of Episcopalian churches has come to, I'll say, embrace gays and gay priests?
So the Episcopal Church, in many ways, operates more nationally as the national branch of the Anglican Communion, and as a diocese, as a local church. And many times the two do not connect well together. So what goes on in one diocese or one country is not uniform throughout the entire Anglican Communion. And I came to the Episcopal Church in one diocese, and then I started the priesthood process in another diocese. Ironically, I started the process in the most conservative diocese of the Episcopal Church, in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh, actually, in 2003, when I was ordained, was also the year that Gene Robinson was also ordained a bishop, and he's our first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church. And his ordination, in many ways, brought to a head that question: should gay and lesbian folks be ordained not just to the diaconate and the priesthood, but also to the episcopate, to bishops? And that brought a great issue to the public forefront, because there were many dioceses ordaining gays and lesbians since the 1970s. There wasn't really a doctrine that was held uniformly across the church. Some dioceses would say, okay, if you're a celibate gay man or woman, that's okay, but you better not have a partner. Then other dioceses would not allow you simply because you put yourself out there being gay or lesbian. And really that act of Gene Robinson's ordination brought the whole entire Episcopal Church to either say yes or no to the issue. And fortunately, through the inspiration, I believe, of the Holy Spirit, in 2003, the Episcopal Church nationally said, this is where we're going. All are welcome to all ranks of holy orders. And that really brought many people to a greater place of inclusion, but also for a small segment of the Episcopal Church, there was schism. So about 10% of Episcopal churches left the denomination and formed their own after this issue of who's in and who's out of the church. Including my own home parish left the Episcopal Church.
Really? Wow.
So, and it's rather painful to go back to this place that was once so welcoming and formed me so much as a Christian and as a priest, to see that no longer part of the Episcopal Church, and 3/4 of the congregation no longer there.
Wow.
So fortunately, I was ordained with not much hassle, because at that time I didn't have a significant other, and I just was doing what needed to be done, and strangely enough, made it through basically with no problem at all. But I realized that I couldn't stay in the Diocese of Pittsburgh. It was really very toxic and very divisive during this early 2000s. So I left, and strange enough, from one side of the state to the other side of the state is a completely different world. And I've been serving in the Philadelphia area since 2004. And the Episcopal Church has gradually, over the last 20 or 30 years, that this is a non-issue almost. Most parishes have no problem having LGBT folks both as members or as clergy, for that matter. That's not uniform because every church is still struggling in their own ways. But I would say a good 80, 90%, this is not an issue at all. And I think that's a beautiful thing that in such a short period of time, the church has gone so far. And then with the addition of marriage equality, that now people of all genders can be married fully in the church, fully recognized, without shame, without exclusion. And I can say as a priest, so many people have come to the church because of this issue of being welcomed in.
Yeah, I was listening a little echo there for a minute. I wonder if that's me, where that's coming from. John, one of the things I wanted to ask you, I know you had some experience in India. What is your experience? And you mentioned this in we talked about earlier. You said that Christianity is a little bit more enlightened than some of these other places. You've been in India. What's your sense as to how other non-Christian cultures view the gay experience?
Well, I think traditional cultures in general. I mean, how do I answer that question? So India has changed a lot since I was there last. India has changed enormously in the last 30, 40 years. But cultures, India is a traditional culture. I mean, it's still, arranged marriages are still very, very common in India. India has, it's just a very, so I think the gay issues, the struggle around gay issues are predominantly a Western European and North American thing, although that's changing now in recent years. It's spread, there are countries around the world that are taking this up. But my point was simply to say that I don't think Christianity is as bad as the rap it gets. And I think there's much about the Christian tradition that predisposes it positively to the embrace of minorities and opens it up around the gay question. But, we're at the very beginning of the liberation movements around LGBT people around the world. So I just don't think that Christianity is uniquely bad, and I don't know that I feel qualified to talk at great length about it in other parts of the world. It's just my experience that it's not as bad as sometimes it gets the rap of, and yet we're in the infancy. The three of us are really the first generation of people who've had this kind of conversation.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Spiritual people, religious people did not talk about homosexuality out loud in public. We didn't marry people. We didn't struggle with LGBT families. This is all very, very recent.
And I think one of the things John brings up, and I think it needs to be stressed, is there's such a difference between what I call Christianity as the establishment versus followers of Jesus. And the establishment is one thing, trying to maintain the status quo, versus the good, caring, loving, compassionate people that follow Jesus in the pews, or priests and religious who are out there amongst the people. There's such tolerance. But what there is a great divide occurs is between the establishment, sometimes the hierarchy, the priesthood sometimes, and what is the people's lived experience. And I think as more and more people interact with people who might be a little bit different, they see how similar they are. And I think that's where this internal change is happening on so many levels, not just the church.
So you're saying there's a difference between the institutional hierarchical structure, particularly in Christianity, and just the people's lived experience.
Exactly right.
I think that really
stressed.
that really plays out statistically around the gay marriage question, because while the church hierarchy is still, at least publicly, overwhelmingly opposed to gay marriage, the people in the pews overwhelmingly support it.
Right.
In the Roman Catholic Church, not to mention in the other Christian denominations, which are even more progressive than the Roman Church. But I think the Roman Church is close to 70% of church-going people support marriage equality. And I think that speaks to the fact that despite the homophobia of the hierarchy, and in many ways the sexual retardation of the clergy within the church, the people have been trained in a tradition which tilts towards justice.
Mm-hmm.
And the social justice teaching of the Catholic Church and of all Christian churches really, I think, does predispose the average faithful person towards a level of fairness and inclusion and love of neighbor despite differences.
I'm going to risk being a little intellectual here, and we can veer off course and veer back away from intellectual. But just one of the things that fascinates me, and John and you and I talked a little bit about this in our conversation earlier, is that when you look about a lot of traditions, I'll use the blanket word traditional experiences, traditions. You've got this kind of role that gay and often transgender people play sort of ceremonially, that they're sort of outside. They're kind of like considered sacred in a certain sense. This is a big question, and I don't know if we can even open it up we can do anything other than open it up. But what do you think is the reason that is the case?
I personally believe God calls people to ministry, particularly people who are on the outside, because that's where Jesus was. I really, truly believe that. If you look at the gospel and you read the gospel with that fresh set of eyes, those Sunday school stories that we learned so many years ago, it's about Jesus constantly reaching out to people. And I think that's why so many people who are on the edges feel called to ministry. Because in many ways, it's Jesus reaching out to those people again and again. And I think that's a beautiful thing. And I think as the church matures, people can be more honest and open about who they are and their lived experience. I think about my own little motley crew and Sunday mornings of the parish I serve. Half of my congregation is LGBT, if not more. So it's kind of a unique place. And people travel and pass other Episcopal churches to come to mine. And I think about the kingdom of God around my altar, where I have a trans woman on one side, a gay man on the other side, and me in the middle, serving the body and blood of Christ each week to people. And that's a beautiful image of God's kingdom. And I think that's why so many people are called into that ministry, because they feel like they can help bridge that gap that sometimes people don't feel between the divine and the world that they're living in.
John, anything you want to add to that?
Well, I think Michael speaks to this very specifically Christian component, because he's engaged in a Christian ministry, and although I'm personally my personal path is Christianity, I really am in a much more of an interfaith ministry in my work with the retreat center, because I have people coming from really all traditions, and people who've been hurt by religious traditions, people who are agnostic and spiritual, people who are in 12 steps and recovery programs, people who practice Buddhist meditation, people who are doing yoga, people who are observant Jews and agnostic Jews, and observant Christians and similarly agnostic Christians. So, but I do find that there's a hunger amongst gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered people to connect to the spiritual dimension, and there's a hunger. And I don't know that that's unique to that community, but I'm not sure I'm adding a whole lot more other than to say that I see this in multiple traditions and amongst people, even who don't even feel confident or committed to a tradition.
I want to kind of end by a kind of maybe a practical question. And I'd like you maybe to think of yourselves as young men and I guess the question is, if there's like a young man out there who's gay and he also feels spiritual, what advice would you give him in terms of reconciling what might be a difficult path?
I think I've done lots of talks with LGBT teens, and a lot of times I'm brought out as the gay priest and do the talk about this type of thing. And I think that yearning to find the spiritual, the divine, is in all of us. But I think you have to find the community that welcomes you for whom God has made you to be. And you shouldn't be in a community that doesn't accept you wholly. And there are so many wonderful traditions within Christianity and other faiths that would welcome you wholly and nurture you and form you and love you. And find those communities, because they're out there and they're growing by leaps and bounds. Every time I turn around, gay Hindu groups, gay Muslim groups, things that I would never have imagined before. I just came across a gay Mormon group. They're out there. You can nurture your heart and your love of God if you only find those right communities. But don't stay put in a community just because that's the one you were told to be in, because you're raised up there. If they don't appreciate you, if they don't value, if they don't love you, please don't stay there and be spiritually abused. Move on to a place that loves you.
Well, beautifully said, Michael. I think that what I would reiterate or underline with Michael is what I would give for advice to young people is find community. Find community, find spiritual community, find community that mirrors back to you your deepest values, find communities in which you can do service, find communities in which you can discover who you are, what you care about, what you love, what fills you with a sense of meaning and joy, because those are the spiritual qualities that all of us need to nurture in our lives, whether they have a particular religious expression or not. Kindness, justice, mercy, forgiveness, love, companionship. These are the things that all of us human beings crave and need, and no one should be deprived of them.
I am going to post information about the St. Philip's and also Eastern Mountain in the show notes. I'm wondering if there's any other resources that you might want to give to people that are listening to this podcast, either of you.
Well, I wouldn't be so silly to presume that those are the only two places people can go.
Exactly.
But there are, I think that people have so much access to things through Google and where their personal interests lie. There's nothing that jumps out at me that is a resource that I think people can't live without. I would say that that people should be kind to others and kind to themselves above and beyond everything else, and then find other people who can support you in that.
Beautifully said. And I think going back to what John, you said earlier, about finding community. That's so important. And finding healthy communities. So many times when people are coming out, the first place they look for community is in bars and clubs. And that's not always the best place. It sometimes can be rather toxic. But find healthy communities, particularly communities of service, of ways you can connect to each other through the arts or through music or through caring for one another. Allow that special gift that you've been given to be shared and to be enhanced.
And get out of Pittsburgh as soon as you can.
Or go back. It's a great
You got hard on Pittsburgh is going through a renaissance.
It is. It's a great place. Maybe not for being early Episcopalian stuff.
So I want to thank both of you for joining me, and I hope this this podcast is of use to anyone who listens to it. Thank you, John and Michael. This has been wonderful and very nurturing, and I really appreciate you guys taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you, Angela, for all you do.
Great. Thanks, guys. I'd like to tell you about a couple of opportunities to get more involved with the Diversity and Spirituality Network. The easiest way to do so is to join our private Facebook group, which you can find by searching for Diversity and Spirituality Network Group on Facebook. Another way is to join us for our regular online community gatherings, which take place on the third Saturday of every month. You can find more about the host and the theme of this month's gathering by going to our website, diversityandspirituality.com/events. Yet another way to get more involved is to support our podcast on Patreon. For as little as $1 a month, you can receive extra behind-the-scenes content and become, in effect, a sponsor of our show. You can find more about it by going to patreon.com and searching for Diversity and Spirituality. Thanks so much for listening, and as always, I look forward to being in touch.
What is diversity? What is diversity?